Last Friday, the entire island of Cuba was plunged into darkness as a result of a power outage. You can put up E2 on the screen. It was the most significant power outage in the history of Cuba since the revolution. I put up E1 here. This is just an example of what an absolutely extraordinary event, which didn't start to it didn't start to kind of unravel itself, to become fixed, to get the lights back on until yesterday. We're going to talk about why this is happening, where this is coming from. But over at Dropsite a couple weeks ago, we published this really fascinating look at Biden's, we'll call it a sanctions regime, but so much of what he's doing, it goes beyond sanctions to Cuba and the way that is impacting the economy there. That piece was written by Ed Augustine, who is a journalist who is based in Havana. So we asked him yesterday to send us a little dispatch about what it has been like over the last 5 days in Havana, where this is coming from. Here's Ed Augustine.
I'm reporting from South Havana, where finally, after 4 days of nationwide rolling power cuts, the lights are finally back on. I was here yesterday afternoon when the lights came back on and people were cheering, and you can well imagine why. It doesn't take much to imagine how difficult life very quickly becomes without electricity. No lights at night, no air conditioning, no fans to keep the mosquitoes and tropical diseases that they carry away, but also problems with the water. Millions of people haven't had running water in Cuba for the last 5 days because the water pumps require electricity. Same story for gas. Cooking gas was losing pressure and was out in parts of Havana. Having said that, the feeling on the ground was a little bit more calm than one might have presumed. If this was to have happened in my own country, the UK, people would have completely lost the plot. And people were stressed here and worried, but not as much as you might think. Cubans are very resilient, or to put it another way, perhaps put up with far too much. But I was interviewing people yesterday, and they said, no, it wasn't a big deal. We're used to power cuts. We've been through this for 60 years. This was the biggest one in Havana that's ever happened. But people kind of shrug, and many people even joke about it. That's a very Cuban thing. Right now in Havana, over 90% of the city has electricity, but it's a different story for the rest of the country. The national grid is up, it is working, but there are still millions of people in this country, approximately 10 million people, that don't have any electricity right now. The government clearly prioritizing for political reasons the capital. They don't want any unrest as they would see it. Why is this happening? Two main reasons. First and foremost, US economic warfare. Cuba has been sanctioned for longer than any other country in recorded history. And right now, the US Treasury Department sanctions some oil tankers that have previously docked in Cuba. And so that strongly dissuades other oil tankers from selling oil to Cuba, dealing with Cuba. That drives up costs. So that's just one of hundreds of measures that the US currently has on Cuba, the aim of which is to provoke crises and desperation so that people rise up and overthrow the government. The other major reason, economic mismanagement, a failed vertically planned economic model. There's complete consensus, or almost complete consensus in Cuba, the current economy is not working, and the Cuban government, despite having their own reform program, have failed to update the system over recent decades. But today, in Havana, a sense of relief. The crisis isn't over. There's still massive problems in terms of being able to afford enough petrol, but relief compared to a couple of days ago.
All right, so he made a couple of interesting points there, and if you go back and read his piece, and we can put up E4 here, this is his piece that he wrote for Dropsite, he talks a lot about the state sponsor of terrorism designation. And so Obama in 2015 basically normalized relations with Cuba and took them off this state sponsor of terror list. Trump, as a kind of a last act, kind of a little thank you to his friends down in South Florida, put them back on the list. And people expected that Biden would immediately revert to the Obama administration's policy. Say, okay, thanks, Trump, you lost. We're not doing this anymore. We've moved beyond this. Instead, the Biden administration came in and ramped things up and made them even tighter. And part of the reason that they were made tighter is that the American sanctions regime in general around the world has gotten has gotten broadly tougher. So anybody who's on this state-sponsored terror list now is facing much sharper teeth around the world. And what happens, and the way that the sanctions work now is that it's much more difficult for the media, say, to pin it directly on Biden. In the past, the U.S. would directly sanction, X, and the media could say, oh, look, you're sanctioning this, it's causing this harm, therefore, we can talk about whether or not this is a policy that ought to be in place. Mm-hmm. By putting them on the state-sponsored terror list, what it does is it makes it basically impossible for them to use the banking system and to do business with anybody else off of the island. And the U.S. would say, well, that's not our problem.
Right.
We don't actually specifically ban this particular provider of grain or oil from providing products to Cuba. We don't bar this particular bank from doing this. But the banks say, because this designation is so opaque and the penalties are so severe, that our lawyers say we should just not do business anywhere near Cuba. Forget it. It might actually be okay, but we're just not going to do it. And as Ed said, they also are specifically sanctioning some particular shipping companies, which is then keeping oil out of Cuba and driving up energy prices.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big picture story is that sanctions are not, I'm not going to say they're categorically unjust and ineffective, but the long-term experiment shows that in many cases they're not effective. Now, I think what the U.S. would say to Cuba is, the good faith actors in the U.S. would say to Cuba is not our problem until you reform your human rights situation. And so I think that's that's the good faith reading. But
and it's also the paper reading. Like we say that our policy is that we believe the Cuban regime should be ousted and that we are going to put sanctions into place until such time as we drive the Cuban people into such desperation that they overthrow the government. So yeah, that is our position. Like, you don't like this? Stop being a communist.
Well, yes, I think that's true. I think also, though, what they would say is this is the good faith reading. Obviously, it's not the reading of people who are just like old cold warriors who are trying to, starve Cubans into regime change, which is, of course, still very much a mindset and mentality that exists in the Pentagon. But also, reform so that you don't rely on all of these other countries for your electrical grid. Have some, even China. This is actually when Cuba has been looking to China. This was in a Financial Times report. I saw a lot of people like amused by this on Twitter. This is from Financial Times. They say, China publicly supports Cuba's right to choose its own path to economic development, quote, in line with its national conditions. But privately, Chinese officials have long urged the Cuban leadership to shift from its vertically planned economy to something closer to the Chinese model, according to economists and diplomats briefed on the situation. Chinese officials have been perplexed and frustrated at the Cuban leadership's unwillingness to decisively implement a market-oriented reform program, despite the glaring dysfunction of the status quo, the people said. And I agree. I think the glaring dysfunction of the status quo is pretty well put.
Yeah.
So that is all to say, it's not, I don't think it's primarily the fault of U.S. sanctions. I think Cuba working within the parameters that it has, I don't support the sanctions entirely, but I think working within the parameters that exist, Cuba could do a better job servicing its people, keeping its people safe and prosperous and healthy. That said, I also don't think there's a great case that the sanctions are protecting the people of Cuba at this point.
And Ed Augustine makes that, he made that point at the end there, talking about how Cuba has talked about reforming its economy, the Cuban government, but has not done so. The politics of that are interesting because the Cuban government is always on its back foot because of these sanctions. They have no political capital with the public to do the kinds of reforms that would be difficult in the first weeks of them, but long-term would lead to more economic growth. And that's not talking about going capitalist. That's talking about moving more toward a Chinese kind of, socialism with market,
Chinese
elements or whatever.
Yeah, market elements.
That would lead to some disruption in the meantime, and so you would need a little bit more political capital to get that going, and they can't do it. And the argument is the reason it's not happening is because the U.S.'s boot is on their neck, that they can't even move. My criticism for the Chinese would be, so then you step up. You're talking a big game about how you think they ought to reform, they can't reform because their economy is in complete shambles because of the United States, it's a rounding error for China to help them out. But China's just not going to do it, which cuts against this idea that we believe that China has some global hegemonic ambitions, which they don't, because they're like, that's a U.S. problem. That's over by North America. We love that, we come from the same father, but they're not going to lift a finger to help the Cuban government.
I mean, I don't know. I could see, not immediately, I agree with that in the immediate future, but I could see long term, this is a great argument, I think, against sanctions, because what Cuba has been doing in light of the post-Trump sanction has been turning to Venezuela, part of the reason this is happening is because Venezuela doesn't have the capacity to keep helping Cuba at the same level that it had been in the past.
Because of sanctions on Venezuela, and Venezuelan oil production has collapsed as a result. I think that's exactly right. If you lifted all the sanctions on Cuba, just let Cuba decide for itself, without the sanctions, what kind of government it wanted to operate, what kind of economy it wanted to operate, they would open up their economy. And it would be a more market-oriented economy that the Cuban regime would try to keep like China.
Well, I was going to say, when that happened under Obama, it was really, predictable where the money was going. And maybe, the experiment didn't get to play out in the long term, but it was becoming concentrated in the hands of elites. Not by any, if you can't compare them to the way that we concentrate money in the hands of the elites, then it's not even close. It's an interesting, I think it's a pretty interesting question of what would happen in the long term, because there are still...
Yeah, exactly, and imagine that. Imagine letting Cuba just decide for itself.
Well, yeah, instead of turning them into the arms of people, for example, who want to threaten semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan that we depend on, potentially. I'm not saying they're actually going to do it, but that's obviously something that's being talked about in Beijing. So no, China may be right about the problems with the Cuban system, but it's not an argument for China to colonize the Cuban system either, in the same way it's not an argument for us to do it. But it feels anytime we have this bickering over Cuba, you just, again, go back to, we are not even 100 years into the nuclear experiment. And the reason that Cuba is such a flashpoint here is because China could be Soviet-esque in putting weapons in Cuba, which makes it a huge threat to the United States.
Right, but they're just not that.
Right, so the US, but so that because of the possibility, you're constantly at loggerheads. It's actually ultimately an argument against nuclear weapons, but that's a different story.
And if people want a couple other details, one of the things we've done that's just completely malicious and vindictive is that we put into place a policy that says if you are European, if you can come to the United States without having to get a visa, which is Europeans and there's 37 countries or so where you can just come to the United States and vacation here, France or whatever. If you go to Cuba, then you now have to get a waiver to come to the United States for the next 10 years. Why? There's no reason for us to do that other than being vindictive. What are we afraid? They're going to fly to Cuba and get cigars and then fly them back to France and then fly them over here and smoke them on a balcony somewhere? So what that did is it completely just dried up European tourism, which was one of the only things they had left. We also allowed Cuban Americans here in the United States to sue cruise lines, saying that actually that ought to be our property. And so cruise ships stopped docking in Havana. So that disappeared. It's just this systematic, anything that Cuba had working for it, we just went after. And then we're oh, look, see, we told you communism doesn't work. Well, and then all the Cubans are flooding the southern border.
Yes, absolutely.
Hundreds of thousands, more than the Mariel boat lift. Absolute, anybody who can leave Cuba is leaving Cuba.
And by way of South America, it's not like Mariel boat lift. Actually,
right. They're flying to Nicaragua and then they're taking a train up.
Yeah. Absolutely. Speaking of humanitarian crises, Ryan, you have a wonderful new report up at DropSite, wonderful for how vivid and detailed it is, especially compared to so many reports that we see in the mainstream press out of Gaza about the destruction of Gaza, essentially. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.